Tonight, we begin not with the miracles, but with the men who died because they believed in them. Not with the sermons or the crowds, but with the blood left behind when the crowds disappeared. You've heard their names: Peter, John, James, Thomas. Men who walked with Jesus, who touched him, who watched him die, and then saw him alive again. They weren't just legends. They weren't untouchable. They were human, and they died like it. Some were speared, some were burned, some were stoned, or crucified, or cut down in silence. But not one of them turned back. They followed the same voice, and every step led them closer to the same end. This isn't a story about how they lived. It's about how they loved him, even when it cost them everything. You're not just reading history. You're standing at the edge of their final moments. You witness the terrible death of the 12 apostles of Jesus and the faith that refused to die with them. But before you get too cozy, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this strange little corner of quiet storytelling. And drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's strangely comforting to know who else is drifting off with us around the world. Now get comfortable, let the day melt away, and we'll drift back together into the quiet corners of the past. The first time you saw him, your hands were soaked with fish slime. You were half crouched over a twisted net, cursing under your breath as the morning sun broke open over the lake. Your fingers were cracked. Your back hurt. And still, the net tangled like it wanted to mock you. You didn't notice him at first. Not until your brother stopped pulling and whispered, "It's him." That made you stand straight, blink the crust from your lashes, and turn. He wasn't tall. Not like you'd imagined. He didn't walk like a priest or a soldier. He just stood there, like the wind belonged to him. Like the lake had been waiting for him to speak. And when he did, it wasn't a command, it was an offer. "Follow me." That was it. No promise, no salary, no escape plan. Just an invitation that lodged somewhere beneath your ribs. You didn't understand it, but your legs did. You dropped the net like it burned. You left the boat rocking in the shallows. You didn't even say goodbye to your father. You thought you were walking into purpose. You didn't realize you were walking toward death. The years that followed, Galilee, Samaria, Judea, blurred together like firelight through wet cloth. Healings, hunger, hope. You watched blind men dance and corpses breathe. You walked on water for half a heartbeat. You saw him glow like lightning on the mountain, then bleed like a man in the garden. You swore you'd never leave. Swore it loud, for everyone to hear. Then came the courtyard, the cold, the fire, the girl with the questions, and the rooster. You remember the sound it made, how it cut through your skull like iron, how your chest folded in on itself like paper. You had said his name with love, now you said it with lies. And still, he looked at you. Not with hate, not even anger, just something worse. Forgiveness, raw and unbearable. You tried to disappear after that. Let the others lead. Let the silence do the talking. But he came back. Of course he did. Death couldn't hold him. And when he found you again, he didn't ask for an apology. He made you breakfast. 3 times he asked, "Do you love me?" And each time you said yes, louder than before. Desperate, he didn't argue, just told you what it meant. "Feed my sheep. Follow me." You did, through prison cells and Roman chains, through mobs and miracles. You stood in synagogues that stank of dust and hate and told them the truth. You watched men gnash their teeth like wolves. You kept preaching. And now here you are, knees buckling on Nero's hill. The dirt smells like ash. The ropes bite your wrists. The cross waits behind you, taller than it should be. The centurion wipes his hands like this is just another job. like you're just another rebel. But you asked for this. Not the death. The direction. Crucify me upside down, you said. I'm not worthy to die like him. They thought it was humility. It wasn't. It was awe. They hoist you. Blood rushes to your skull. The sky spins. You can barely breathe. But you remember the lake, the net, the voice, the promise. That wasn't a promise at all. Just a man who said, "Follow me." And now, at last, you are. You always knew this wouldn't end in peace. The garden still stung your nose. Olive leaves crushed beneath boots. The metallic smell of blood and sweat and iron. You'd swung your sword like a fool. You'd meant to protect him, meant to be brave. All you managed was a severed ear and a rebuke. Put your sword away, Peter. And just like that, the moment passed. Now he was taken, dragged through the shadows like a criminal, and you followed, but not too close. The others had scattered. John stayed near, always quieter, always braver than you thought, but you. Your legs moved like they belonged to someone else. And when you reached the courtyard, you stayed on the edges. There was a fire burning in the center, the kind of fire that smells of wet wood and charred meat. Roman soldiers stood around it, warming their hands. Servants drifted like moths to the flame, whispering, waiting. You hovered at the rim, hood low, eyes searching for a way to belong there without being seen. You couldn't hear what they were doing to him inside, but you heard the tone, the slap of hands on flesh, the guttural threats. You knew that kind of laughter. It was the sound of men pretending they weren't afraid. Then she looked at you. Just a girl. Not old, not dangerous. Her voice was curious, not cruel. You were with him, the Galilean. Your stomach clenched. The words rose on their own. I don't know what you're talking about. She blinked, moved on, but now you were sweating. The fire warmed your face, but your insides turned to ice. You shifted position, tried to blend with the crowd. But someone else caught your voice, your accent. You're one of them. This time it came quicker, sharper. The lie tasted bitter. I am not. Then silence, stretching too long. You turned your back to the fire. The light made your face too easy to read. Shadows were safer. But it happened again. The third one didn't ask. He accused. I saw you with him in the garden. This time you snapped. Anger flared. Quick, instinctive, false. I swear to God, I do not know the man. The moment shattered. Behind you, a sound pierced the dark. The slow, aching crow of a rooster. It was distant, but unmistakable. Like the night itself remembered. Like the world had been holding its breath for this exact betrayal. And then you saw him. He was across the courtyard, bruised, blood drying at the corner of his mouth, his robe torn, wrists bound, eyes blackened. They were dragging him toward the next insult, the next blow. But for one breath, he wasn't looking at them. He was looking at you. Not with surprise, not even with disappointment. Just pain. Pain and love that refused to leave. You turned and ran. Your feet found the stone steps. Your knees gave out before the gate. You bent in the dark, retching, choking on shame. The world blurred. Your chest heaved like it couldn't bear your own heartbeat. You had sworn your life to him. And when it counted, you threw him to the dogs. All you could do was weep. The others would hear. John, Mary, maybe even Judas. And when the morning came, so would the truth. But you didn't care. Not anymore. You'd failed him. You'd failed yourself. You thought that would be the end of your story. But it was only the beginning of your death. The sea smelled like it always had. Salt, fish, the wet rod of rope. You'd return to it like a dog returns to a familiar corner. Cast your net, wait, pull, repeat. It was easier than thinking. Easier than remembering what you'd done, what you hadn't. There were 7 of you that day, drifting on the old boat, trying to be something other than what you'd become. All night, the net stayed empty. Dawn crept up slowly, brushing the water with light. You were exhausted, not just in your limbs, but in your chest, behind your eyes. Then a voice called out from the shore, casual, like a neighbor. "Children, have you caught anything?" You hadn't. "Cast the net on the right side of the boat," he said, as if that would change anything. But you did it anyway, and in seconds, the rope strained. The net surged, heavy with life, nearly tearing from the weight of it. 153 fish. You didn't count them until later, but you remembered the exact number. You remembered because the moment the net groaned, John looked at you and whispered, "It is the Lord." You didn't wait. You didn't care. You tore your shirt over your head, dove into the water, and swam hard, cutting through the cold, through the shame, through every memory of the courtyard and the rooster's cry. Your feet hit the sand, legs trembling, chest heaving, and there he was. Jesus. Alive. He had made a fire. Bread warmed on the stone, and fish sizzled beside it. It was quiet, almost absurd in its normalcy, like the world hadn't just ended and begun again, like the one you denied hadn't come back to meet you for breakfast. You sat there dripping, unable to speak. He waited until everyone had eaten. Then he looked at you. He called you by the name he had given you, not Simon, Peter, the rock. "Do you love me more than these?" You couldn't meet his eyes at first, but you nodded. "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Feed my lambs." You blinked, unsure if that was enough. He asked again, "Do you love me?" You swallowed. "Yes, Lord, you know I love you. Tend my sheep." A third time, the same question. Your chest tightened. The words scratched in your throat. "Do you love me?" It hurt this time, not because you didn't mean it, but because he knew exactly why he had to ask it 3 times. And so did you. You said it anyway. "Lord, you know everything. You know I love you." He didn't smile. He didn't nod. He just said the words that changed everything again. "Feed my sheep." You would have done anything in that moment, anything to make it right. But he wasn't done. "Truly, truly, I say to you, when you were young, you dressed yourself and walked wherever you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will dress you and carry you where you do not want to go." You understood, not all at once, but deep in your bones. He was telling you how it would end, not with peace, not with comfort, but with a cross. And this time, there would be no sword to swing, no courtyard to run from. There would only be the road you would follow, and the death you would not escape. Then he said the words you first heard by the lake, when your hands were still full of nets and your heart full of questions. "Follow me." He didn't ask you to understand. He didn't ask you to survive. He asked you to follow. Rome reeked of smoke and sweat and iron. The city was swollen with people, merchants, slaves, soldiers, and something else lingered beneath it all. Fear. It was the year Nero burned half his empire to ash and needed someone to blame. The rumors spread fast, faster than fire through timber. The Christians had done it. And so, the emperor pointed his finger, and Rome turned savage. You had known this day would come. You had seen it in his eyes, long ago, on a beach where the morning coals still glowed. "You will stretch out your hands," he'd said. It hadn't felt like poetry then. It feels even less so now, standing in chains beneath the scowl of a Roman prefect, your name already carved into the scroll of the condemned. They led you through the city as if you were a criminal, though you had no weapon, as if you were a threat, though your only kingdom was made of hearts and not stone. Citizens spat as you passed. Some wept. Most just watched. You could hear the jeering from Nero's palace, even at a distance. Laughter fueled by madness and wine. The execution ground was a hill just outside the city, a barren patch of earth that stank of old blood and fresh timber. The soldiers dragged the cross into place. They asked if you had any last words. You looked up at the beams, already stained red from others who had died before you, and you made one request, not for mercy, not for reprieve. Crucify me upside down. They didn't understand. They thought it was fear, that you couldn't face the same death as your master. But it wasn't fear. It was love. It was the only thing you could still offer. The last act of a life full of stumbles and fire and restoration. You weren't worthy to die the way he did. So they turned the cross. The world flipped as they hoisted you into the sky, feet first. Blood rushed to your head, your lungs tightened. The pain grew sharper than you imagined, but it didn't matter. The sky was streaked with flame from Nero's torches, but beyond the smoke you could still make out the stars. And in their light, you saw him again, not with your eyes, but with something deeper. You had followed him through storms, through doubt, through denial and forgiveness. Now, you followed him into death. Everything tilted. The crowd blurred. The shouting softened. And then, in the hush of your last breath, you saw the face you had once denied, waiting. And the world went dark. But you weren't the first. The fire began years before, with a man who died, praying for his killers. Jerusalem's streets always pulsed with tension, but that day it boiled. You stood at the center of the storm, surrounded by men whose eyes didn't blink and fists that didn't unclench. The Sanhedrin sat in their lofty chamber like judges above a pyre, but you didn't tremble. Their laws were old, your fire was new. You had known this moment would come, maybe not the way it arrived. Dragged, shoved, accused. But you had always felt the Spirit pushing you to the edge. Ever since Pentecost, your voice had carried more than sound. It carried light, and light is never welcomed in dark places. They called you a blasphemer, said you spoke against the temple, against Moses, against God himself. The same things they said about him. And that was how you knew you were exactly where you were supposed to be. You weren't one of the 12. You hadn't sat at the table during the Last Supper, but you had tasted the bread of life all the same. You had seen the sick healed by a whisper of his name. You had seen the poor fed, the broken mended, the lost found. And now you stood before the wolves with nothing in your hands but truth. They demanded a defense. You gave them a sermon. You told them of Abraham, of Joseph, of Moses, standing barefoot before the bush that burned but was not consumed. You spoke of the tabernacle, the wilderness, the prophets. You wove together their entire history and then tore off the veil they used to hide behind. You stiff-necked people, you said, your voice steady. You always resist the Holy Spirit. The chamber shook, not from an earthquake, but from fury. Faces turned red. Hands gripped stones they had not yet been told to throw. But you weren't finished. You murdered the righteous one. You received the law, but you never kept it. They screamed, but you looked up, because while the council saw only a man to silence, you saw the sky split open. The courtroom faded, the walls dissolved, and heaven rushed into view. And there, radiant, real, alive, stood the Son of Man at the right hand of God. Not seated, standing, as if waiting to welcome you home. You spoke what you saw, and that's when they grabbed you. No trial, no verdict, just violence. They dragged you outside the city. The crowd followed, frenzied, ravenous. You fell to your knees as the first stone hit. Then another, and another. Bone cracked, skin split. Blood blurred your vision, but you saw the light still. You did not curse them. You did not cry out for justice. You prayed, Lord, do not hold this sin against them. And as your body collapsed under the weight of hatred, your spirit rose into the arms of mercy. They threw rocks, but heaven opened. You stood with their coats at your feet, arms crossed, face blank. The rocks flew past you, dull thuds echoing against flesh and bone. Blood hit the ground in sputtering drops, not all at once, but in slow, deliberate punctuation. The man in the center, Stephen, they called him, had stopped shielding his face. His lips moved, but not in panic. He wasn't begging, he was praying. You told yourself this was necessary. He had blasphemed, stood before the council with the arrogance of a man possessed. He accused your fathers of betrayal, dared to say he saw God, dared to say he saw Jesus. Jesus, the cursed one, the crucified. You clenched your jaw. The name alone was an infection, spreading through the synagogues, weakening the spine of your people. Someone had to stop it. You believed you were that someone. So you stood still as the mob did its work. You heard the break of ribs, the soft moan that slipped out when the first stone caught him under the eye. You didn't flinch. Not even when his blood splashed the hem of a robe. You had trained yourself to see through a fence and find the order underneath it. The law was clear. A heretic must die. But something in you stuttered when he looked up. You thought he'd curse you, thought he'd scream or spit or cry for mercy. Instead, his face lit up. Not in madness, but clarity. Like he was seeing something you couldn't. And the words that left his cracked lips weren't for revenge. Do not hold this sin against them. You didn't understand it. Not then. You shook it off, called it delusion, pride, some trick of adrenaline and fading consciousness. You hardened your heart like you'd been taught, swallowed any softness that rose in your throat. The crowd drifted away, breathless and satisfied. Someone laughed. Someone else limped. You stayed. His body didn't look like a victory. It looked like a question you didn't want to answer. You dragged that silence with you back into the city. You buried it under your missions, under your letters of authority. You ran harder after the people who bore his name, thinking maybe if you were fast enough, brutal enough, loud enough, you could silence the echo of that voice. But it followed you, through the streets, through the prisons, through the long nights when your eyes wouldn't close. You remembered his prayer more than his blood. You remembered how he didn't defend himself, how he smiled like he knew something you didn't. That haunted you. You didn't know it then, not when you stood with your back straight and your heart cold, but his death would ruin your life. And in ruining it, save it. The cell is small enough that you can touch both walls with your outstretched arms. Cold air leaks through the cracks between the stones. You've stopped shivering. There's no point. Your body already knows what's coming. You've felt it building for days. Whispers in the street, tension in the guard's silence, the way they don't look you in the eye when they slide bread through the gate. You've seen this before in other cities, with other names, but this time it's your own. You are James, son of Zebedee, brother to John, one of the first to leave everything behind. You still remember the boat, the rough planks, the calloused hands of your father, the way the sea smelled when Jesus walked past and simply said, "Follow me." You didn't hesitate then. You don't now. You don't know how long you've been in this cell. You stopped measuring by sunrise. There's a soldier stationed outside, young with dark eyes and a scar under his chin. He doesn't speak, but he watches. At first, you thought it was hatred, but now it looks more like hunger, like he's waiting for something, or hoping for it. When they finally come for you, there are no announcements, just the sound of iron hinges groaning open and the clatter of armor echoing down the corridor. You stand without being told. Your wrists are bound. You don't struggle. The hallway is narrow and smells of mold and blood. You walk slowly, not because you're afraid, but because you're listening. You can hear birds outside, the murmur of a crowd beyond the courtyard wall. Somewhere out there, your brother is still preaching. Somewhere, the others are still moving, like sparks in dry grass, and that's enough. The executioner is already waiting. The sword glints in the light, resting against his leg like a question waiting to be answered. You step forward, and that's when the soldier moves. Not to stop the blade, to kneel. He drops beside you, eyes wet, voice shaking. He says he's watched you every day, says he's seen how you pray, how you never curse, how you smile, even when there's nothing left to smile about. He says he doesn't understand it, but he wants it. He says he believes. And then he asks for the impossible. He asks to die with you. You look at him. You don't ask him if he's sure. You don't try to talk him out of it. You only place your hand on his shoulder and pray that whatever faith has bloomed in him will carry him home. The sword comes swiftly. It always does. There is no crowd cheering, no anthem, no speech, just the sound of steel slicing through the day and two bodies falling like answered prayers. You don't feel like a hero. You don't feel like a martyr. You feel like a fisherman who never stopped casting his net. You didn't plan to die a legend. You just didn't stop speaking. The upper room was quiet, heavy with absence, not just the absence of Judas, but of clarity. The 11 sat together, their eyes not quite meeting. You stood among them, Matthias, waiting. Not for glory, not even for purpose, just to belong, to fill a hole that no one wanted to speak of out loud. Peter stood, his voice rough with sleep and sorrow. He quoted scripture like it was wood to hold on to in a storm. Let another take his office. The others nodded. You and one other, Justice, were brought forward. Men who had followed from the beginning. Witnesses, they said. You had seen the baptism, the miracles, the betrayal. You were there, even when your name was forgotten. They prayed. The prayer wasn't long or poetic. It was the kind whispered through clenched teeth, the kind made when you're not asking for an answer, but bracing for one. Then they cast the lots. Pebbles clattered against wood. A pause, a breath, and your name, chosen, not by them, but by him. They laid hands on you. There were no cheers, no songs, just hands and silence and weight. The room shifted. The number was whole again, 12. But the shadow of the one who had fallen never fully left. You didn't try to outshine the others. You didn't lead revivals or pen letters that would echo through centuries. You walked. You preached. You endured. You crossed cities where no one knew your name, spoke to faces that only stared. You saw conversions. You saw rejection. You saw both bleed into each other. Years passed like smoke through cracks in stone. You grew older, not in bitterness, but in resolve. You weren't called to greatness, just to faithfulness, so you gave it. The mission led you east. Ethiopia, Cappadocia, some say even as far as the Caspian. The towns changed, but the message didn't. Christ crucified, Christ risen. You repeated it until your throat grew raw, until the words etched grooves into your ribs. You were called a fool, a traitor, a threat. You were chased from one city to the next. Still, you did not stop. Then one day, the crowd didn't shout. They gathered. Stone by stone, they formed a ring. Your body in the center, your voice still lifting the name they hated. You had time to run. You didn't. The first stone split the skin above your eye. The second cracked a rib. Your knees buckled, but your mouth kept moving. You could not see their faces anymore. Only the sky. Only the place beyond it. You whispered your last words like a man handing off a secret. The rocks fell harder. The crowd thinned. The dust settled. You died without a monument. No scrolls carry your letters. No church bears your name in stained glass. But the number was whole because of you. The wound was filled because of your yes. You never asked for a legacy. You only stayed when others scattered. They stoned you alone, but you were never silent. And some deaths take longer. And some men carry their crosses for years before it finally drops them. They came for you in the night, torches swaying like ghosts in the wind. You heard their footsteps before you saw their faces, and you didn't run. You hadn't run in years, not when the threats first came, not when they dragged others away, not even when the rumors began, that your words had stirred the wrong hearts in the wrong places. Greece had been kind at first, receptive, curious, hungry even. You spoke plainly, never with flair. You weren't your brother, and you never pretended to be. Peter was fire. You were a steady ember. People came to you not for spectacle but for peace. You healed a few. You comforted more. You told them about the man who hung on a cross and forgave the ones who placed him there. And then one day, your name reached the wrong ears. They said you were a disturber of the gods, that you spoke against the state, that your stories were poison to the empire's bones. You didn't defend yourself. You never did. Truth didn't need your defense. It only needed your voice. They tied your hands not with rope, but with authority, paraded you through the streets like a warning. People watched. Some wept. Most turned away. You smiled at the few who didn't. You told them you weren't afraid, that death wasn't the end, that Jesus had already walked through it and opened it like a door. The cross was waiting. It wasn't like his. Not straight, not tall. Yours was tilted like a broken window, an X. They bound your arms and legs to each beam. No nails. Not because they pitied you, but because ropes made it last longer. You felt the cords bite into your skin. Your back strained against gravity. Breathing took effort. Speaking took more. But you did both. For 2 days, you preached between gasps. Not with shouts, but with clarity. You spoke of mercy, of blood that still speaks, of wounds that heal. You told them you were not dying for an idea, but for a friend. You told them he had died first, willingly, lovingly, and that he had risen. Some listened, some cursed. One knelt. The sun scorched your face by day. The wind stung your eyes by night. Pain blurred the edges of your mind, but not your purpose. You were never the center. Just a voice on the edge of history, calling out faithfully. On the third morning, your lungs could no longer obey you. Your heart stuttered. The world dimmed. You looked up as far as your head could tilt and saw the sky glowing gold behind the clouds. You whispered the name that had never failed you. And then you let go. You didn't want to be remembered. Just faithful. You've nailed down dozens of them. You stopped counting after the first 100. The wood always groans the same, whether it's in the cold of winter or beneath the heat of summer sun. The ropes creak, the iron rings, and the skin splits in ways you've memorized. There's a rhythm to it now, like sharpening a blade or saddling a horse. Efficient, precise, unflinching. You tell yourself it's just your duty. That Rome needs its silence. That when men scream and beg and bleed out under the sky, it's not cruelty, it's control. And you're just a hand, a tool. You don't make the laws, you enforce them. But something's wrong this time. It started when they brought the man in chains. He didn't fight, didn't argue, didn't even beg. He just looked at you, and something in your stomach turned. You've seen fear dressed up as bravery before. You know the masks men wear, but he didn't have one. His eyes were clear, not empty, not proud, just certain. You knew his name, Peter, some kind of preacher from the East, said to follow a crucified God. The crowd called him dangerous. The emperor said he was a threat. You'd been assigned the task. Simple, fast, public. He asked for one thing. Turn the cross upside down. You nearly laughed. Most cry for mercy. He asked for humility. You shrugged, ordered it done. It was unusual, but not forbidden. Just more work. You thought it would make the death harder, more painful, more drawn out. You thought maybe that was the real reason he asked. But when the cross lifted, And he hung there, bleeding, trembling, lungs collapsing. He didn't curse. He sang. Not loud, not pretty, but with purpose. You watched him die slowly, watched the light fade from his eyes, and the stillness take his limbs. And something in you cracked. Just a hairline fracture in the wall you'd built around your soul. But it was there. That should have been the end. But days later, in a back alley near the river, you heard it again. A voice. Preaching. Not angry, not seditious, just calm, like water over stone. You turned the corner, hand on your blade, ready to silence the madness, but it was him. Not Peter, but another. He sat on a crate, face worn, ribs showing through his robe. He coughed between sentences. His breath was shallow. Each word cost him something, but he spoke anyway. About love, about resurrection, about a kingdom not built by soldiers, but by sacrifice. You don't remember when your hand left your sword. You just remember leaning against the wall and listening. You told yourself it was out of curiosity, that you were watching for a threat. But something deeper was happening. Because as he spoke, your mind drifted, not forward, but back. Back to another hill, another man, another cross. You remember the way he looked at you, the way he groaned as the spikes went through his wrists, the way he whispered something to the sky before he died. You didn't understand it then. You thought it was madness. But now you wonder. You're not ready to believe. Not yet. But something inside you is waking up. Because this quiet man with broken lungs sounds just like the last one. And it reminds you of another man you nailed down. The first time they dragged you in chains, you barely felt them. The weight around your wrists didn't compare to the weight you used to carry inside your chest. Not after Damascus. Not after the voice, the light, the silence. That day still lives inside you, brighter than fire, sharper than thunder. When everything you thought was strength shattered, and all that was left was grace. You were Saul then, a man of laws, of lineage, of certainty. You knew how to crush rebellion. You knew how to make heretics bleed. You didn't know mercy. Not until it found you flat on your back, blind and broken, hearing a voice you had tried to silence. Now, years later, the scars on your body outnumber the pages you've written. Stoned, whipped, mocked, betrayed. Once you were shipwrecked, clinging to a piece of timber while waves swallowed the sky. Another time, bitten by a viper, the soldiers waiting for your body to seize. But you lived. Not because you were strong, but because the one who stopped you on that road had work still to do. They say you turned the world upside down. You say you were just following orders. You walked more miles than most men ride, ate less than you needed, slept less than you wanted, spoke in courts and marketplaces with fishermen and kings. You wrote letters in the dark, by candlelight, when your wrists were swollen and your back still bled. You called yourself least of the apostles, chief of sinners, but you kept writing. Even now, you can feel the iron shackles digging into your skin as you scrawl one last time. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. You know the end is close. Rome doesn't keep men like you alive long, not when your words spread faster than their armies, not when your hope is louder than their fear. Nero's blade is coming, and you've made peace with it. You don't ask to be spared. You only ask that the parchment makes it to Timothy. The cell smells of sweat and mildew. You've grown thin, your breath ragged, but your eyes burn with the same fire you felt on that road. They can't take that. You've been emptied 1,000 times. And every time, he filled you back up. You hear footsteps. You don't flinch. The door opens. A man in armor steps in. He looks bored, routine. To him, this is nothing more than another execution, a name on a list, a job to be done. To you, its arrival. You stand, weak but unbent. They lead you outside the city. There's no crowd, just dust and sky. They tell you to kneel. You do. You whisper his name one last time, not in fear, not even in desperation, but in worship. The sword rises. The sun catches the edge of the blade. And just before it falls, you think of the churches, the brothers, the letters, the prisons, the laughter, the tears. You think of the road to Damascus. You think of the moment love found you. The sword falls, and grace flows wider still. You never cared for the noise, the crowds, the clamor, the debates in the square. Others carried fire in their voices, but you carried something quieter. You were James, son of Alphaeus. The other James, the lesser one, the name the scrolls barely mention. You walked behind the louder men, your feet steady, your words few, but you listened, you prayed, you stayed. You watched miracles happen with your own eyes, but never chased the wonder. You saw the dead rise, the blind see, the lame dance in the dust. And while others ran to tell, you lingered to comfort those who still wept. You were always there, just behind the curtain of history, where heaven watches even if the world does not. When he died, you didn't run. When he rose, you wept. When the Spirit came, you received it like rain on dry ground. You were never the voice thundering from the mountaintop, but the presence kneeling at its base. Years passed. Cities changed. Empires pressed down harder. But you stayed in Jerusalem, the city that killed prophets and broke hearts. You stayed for the church, for the people who still looked over their shoulders when they prayed, for the ones who couldn't forget the feel of the cross under Roman fists. They asked you to lead. You didn't ask for it, didn't chase it, but you said yes. And you led not with force, but with fasting, not with commands, but compassion. You wrote to the scattered ones. Be doers of the word, not hearers only. You warned the rich, comforted the weary, spoke with the weight of a man who knew the cost of silence. But the temple priests never forgot your allegiance. They watched you, listened for slips. They said your words weakened the nation, that your loyalty to the crucified rabbi dishonored the law. You stood in the same temple courts where he once flipped tables. Now, they brought you to the top of the wall and pointed to the crowd below. They told you to denounce him. They told you to shout that Jesus was not the Christ. You looked over the edge and saw the same streets where he once walked, the same people he once fed, and you raised your voice. Not in denial, but in declaration. He sits at the right hand of God. The shove came quick. Stone met flesh. Air split around you. Your body slammed the ground with the sound of finality. Bones shattered. Teeth broke. But you were not finished. On your hands and knees, you began to pray. The same words he had spoken on a different hill. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do. Someone shouted. A rock flew. Another followed. You didn't cry out. You didn't shield your head. You simply turned your face to the sky and mouthed the name that had never failed you. And then, silence. History would barely record your death. The world moved on without songs, without scrolls, without statues. But heaven stood, because you never sought a spotlight, only a savior. You used to dream of fire, not warmth, but destruction. You were a zealot, born into chains and raised with your fists clenched. Rome poisoned everything it touched, and you were ready to cut that poison out with a blade if you had to. You trained in the dark, memorized the weak points of a man's body, studied the silent art of killing for freedom. You hated compromise. You hated the ones who paid taxes with forced smiles. You hated the slow death of your people under an empire that never blinked. Then he looked at you. You expected him to call you out. Name your anger, your violence, your bloodlust. But he didn't. He said, "Follow me." That was it. No argument, no threat. Just an invitation that somehow undid you from the inside out. You watched him touch the unclean, heal Roman servants, speak gently to the kind of people you thought deserved to burn. You stood with the others when he talked about turning cheeks and loving enemies, and your hands itched to disagree, but your heart stayed. Slowly, painfully, your rage began to bend. Not disappear, just transform. You never lost your fire. You just changed what you were burning for. You still walked like a fighter. Still had the edge of someone who once knew how to vanish in the alleys, but your weapon wasn't steel anymore. It was truth, the kind that split lies open and set people free. You traveled further than you thought possible, carrying the name you once cursed into cities that had never heard a single word of it. Persia was foreign soil, its gods carved from stone, its priests wrapped in gold. You knew the risk when you preached there. You could feel the tension in the air every time you spoke, but you spoke anyway. Not with arrogance, with ache. You told them of a kingdom not made by soldiers, but by sacrifice. A king who died instead of killing. A throne made from wood and blood. One morning they came for you. No warning, no trial. They pulled you from the house before you could finish praying. Your wrists were bound, your feet kicked out from under you. They didn't explain. They didn't need to. You saw it in their eyes. You'd seen it before, in the eyes of men who believe they're cleansing something when they kill. Some say they crucified you. Some say they sawed your body in two. It doesn't matter. What matters is you didn't fight back. You didn't spit. You didn't curse. You didn't beg them to spare your life. You simply said his name, over and over, like it was the only weapon you had left. You used to think dying was glorious, if it was for revolution. But now you knew better. You weren't dying for vengeance. You were dying for love. Your blood soaked into foreign earth, where no one would write your name. But heaven knew it. And the fire that once craved war now burned with peace. You learned that blood could be holy when it was spilled for love. Your name was a shadow you never chose. Judas. Not Iscariot, but no one ever heard the second half. They just flinched when they heard the first. So you started using the other name, Thaddeus. It meant heart or courage, depending on who translated it. You weren't trying to hide, just trying to speak without everyone shrinking from your voice. You had followed him from the early days. Watched the blind open their eyes. Watched demons scream and flee at a whisper. You didn't talk much, not like Peter or James or even Thomas, but you listened. You leaned in when he taught. You remembered the quiet things he said when no one else was paying attention. You heard him say, "If anyone loves me, he will keep my word." And you believed it. That's why you went east. You and Simon. Not the fisherman. Simon the Zealot. He had fire in his veins. You had something softer. He carved paths with passion. You filled the silence he left behind. Together, you preached in places that had never even heard of Jerusalem. Dust rose beneath your feet in Mesopotamia, Syria, and Persia. You baptized strangers in rivers no one had mapped yet. You watched small flames catch in the hearts of forgotten people. You thought maybe that would be your legacy. Whispers of hope in unfamiliar tongues. But one day, the gates didn't open. The crowd gathered too fast, too angry. Their faces were stone, their hands already full. The governor didn't even bother with pretense. "You were disrupting the gods," he said, stirring unrest. The punishment was death. You and Simon locked eyes. You didn't panic. You had both known this was coming. They dragged you to the edge of the temple, a crowd pressing in behind them like a tide. You tried to speak, to say just one more thing about mercy, about the kingdom that couldn't be burned or buried. But the first blow knocked the words from your jaw. A club. wood and iron. Your knees gave. The blood came quick. You heard Simon cry out, not in fear, but in defiance. You felt the earth against your face. The second blow didn't hurt as much. Then the sword came. They didn't even wait for silence. They took your head as if it were nothing more than a warning to others. The bodies were left where they fell. 2 men with no monuments, just blood in the dust. But what they didn't see, what they couldn't stop, was the fire moving behind you. The ones you had baptized, the ones who had listened in alleyways and doorways and beside wells. They remembered. They repeated. They passed your words, like bread, from hand to hand. You didn't write letters. You didn't walk on water. You weren't even remembered without confusion. But you were faithful. You were willing. And when the club fell, you didn't curse. You simply gave your last breath to the one who had given you your name. The East ran red with their blood, but the gospel kept walking, even into places no one expected it to reach. You remember the sound of coins, the weight of them, the feel of the table beneath your fingers, smooth and stained with ink and betrayal. You had spent years counting other people's money and watching their eyes fill with hate when they handed it over. You didn't care, not then. You thought power came in silver and silence. Then he passed by. He didn't scold you, didn't list your sins or drag your name through the dirt like everyone else did. He just said 2 words, "Follow me," and everything inside you broke loose. You left the table, left the coins, left the safety of your cynicism. You followed him into a story you never expected to belong to. You weren't a preacher. You weren't brave. You just knew this. Man saw you and didn't flinch. So you watched. You listened. And later, when he was gone, you wrote. You wrote it all. From the genealogy that grounded him in human dust to the final command echoing into every nation. You wrote it carefully, not for scholars, but for people like you. Outsiders, doubters, the ones the world had already priced and discarded. You could have stayed in Jerusalem, could have let your words be your legacy, but the gospel kept burning in your bones. So you went, south, through wilderness and dust, into places where his name still rang like thunder. Ethiopia was unfamiliar land. Bright skies, strange tongues, hands that reached for healing with the same desperation you once knew. You told them about a man who touched lepers, a man who told stories with dirt on his hands, a man who bled, not to shame them, but to save them. They listened, and for a while that was enough. You planted churches, you fed widows, you taught what had been taught to you. Then came the whisper. You were a threat, a man of peace, but still a danger to their gods, their order, their control. The whispers became commands. The threats grew louder. You didn't run. You were leading mass when they came. Robes still damp from washing feet, the bread not yet broken. You stood in front of the altar as they stormed in, eyes wild, swords drawn. You didn't shout. You didn't resist. You just raised your hands. They dragged you outside. The dirt was warm beneath your knees. The wind carried songs from the people still hiding in their homes, and you knew the end had come. The blade flashed. Your blood met the dust, and the page turned. But the story didn't end. They copied your words, carried them across deserts and seas, spoke them in candlelit rooms, in prison cells, in sanctuaries built from stone and hope. You weren't there to see it, but you had written enough. You weren't just a tax collector. You were a witness. You wrote it down so you'd remember what he died to say. You always asked too many questions. The others called it doubt. You called it honesty. You didn't want fairy tales. You wanted scars you could touch, hands you could see, breath you could feel. When they said he was alive, you didn't mock them. You just needed more. You needed to see for yourself that death had truly lost. And then he came, not to scold you, not to shame you, just to show you. Put your finger here. Touch my side. You didn't need to. The moment you saw his eyes, the fight left you. The ache, the weight, the skepticism, it all collapsed under those wounds. You fell to your knees and whispered what your heart had always longed to believe. My Lord and my God. That moment stayed with you longer than any miracle. It burned deeper than any doubt. So when the others scattered across the world, you didn't hesitate. You took the road east, farther than most would dare, past deserts and mountains, past comfort, past memory. You walked until the language changed, until the stars above you felt unfamiliar. You preached Christ in tongues you barely understood, taught fishermen and kings and children and widows about the man who let you touch his scars. India became your second home. They listened there. At first, the people were curious, open, even hungry. You baptized them in rivers that whispered through forests. You prayed in temples once raised to other gods. You wept with the sick. You ate with strangers. You told them the story over and over. He died. He rose. I saw him. I touched him. And he changed everything. But peace never stays long where truth stirs the ground. The priests grew angry, the rulers nervous. They called you a foreign deceiver, said your words threatened their order, your presence insulted their gods. You didn't fight. You didn't flee. You only folded your hands and prayed that the seeds you planted would grow, even if your life was the cost. They found you one morning, alone beneath the trees, kneeling. Your eyes were closed. Your lips were moving. They circled in silence. And then the first spear struck. You gasped, but not in fear. You turned your head just enough to look at them. And even as the second spear came, you whispered something they couldn't understand. It wasn't defiance. It was devotion. You weren't afraid. Because once you had doubted. But then he let you see. And nothing, not time or pain or steel, had ever erased that moment. You bled into the soil of a foreign land. You died without a witness. But heaven saw, and the one who met you in your doubt stood waiting. You doubted once, but never again. They once called you Nathaniel, a name wrapped in quiet places and fig tree shade, a name spoken by a teacher who saw you before you ever saw him, an Israelite, in whom there is no deceit. You never forgot that moment, not the tone of his voice, not the warmth behind the words. He knew you before your name ever mattered. But somewhere along the way, the name faded, and you became Bartholomew, the one who followed, the one who carried the gospel farther than most would ever travel. You didn't mind the silence that followed your steps. You weren't chasing renown. You were chasing his echo, the sound of sandals on shorelines, of laughter over fire, of words that opened heaven with a whisper. You walked across borders, through kingdoms stitched together by fear. You spoke where you could, healed when they let you, and left before the soldiers arrived. You weren't flashy, you weren't loud, but you were relentless. And in the end, that was enough to make them afraid of you. Armenia was a land of gods carved in stone, temples heavy with smoke and gold. You spoke of a different kingdom, one without idols, one where power came not from conquest but from surrender. At first, they listened, until one too many hearts changed, until the priests felt their grip loosen, until the king's nephew believed you. Then they took you. They didn't want a quick death. They wanted a warning. You had seen men crucified, stoned, burned. But this was something else. They tied your hands, stripped your robe, and brought out the knives. And they began to cut. Not deep at first, just enough to let the blood rise, to peel you back inch by inch, like bark from a tree. They worked slow, methodical, crafting pain with hands that had done it before. Your skin came off in strips. Your nerves screamed. So did you, but not for rescue. You screamed his name, over and over, like a song with only one note. Not begging, declaring. You didn't plead for mercy. You had already received it long ago, under that fig tree, when the world was still whole. The crowd watched, some with horror, some with delight. But no one could look away. They thought they were unmaking you. But with every breath you spent on his name, something stronger took root. They beheaded you to finish the job. The body dropped. The blood kept running. But so did the gospel. You never wrote a letter, never preached to emperors, never stood on a stage. But your silence had always been full of him. Even your screams. You screamed, but not for rescue, for heaven. It started with 3 words, simple, unremarkable maybe, to anyone else. But they held more weight than 1,000 sermons. Come and see. That was all you said. Not an argument. Not a demand. Just a door, cracked open for another to look through. You had seen him first, walking, speaking, moving through dust, with a grace that didn't belong to this world. And when he called your name, you followed. No debate, no delay. You just stood and walked. The world shifted under your feet and never settled again. You told Nathaniel about him, with eyes still wide from wonder. And when Nathaniel doubted, you didn't try to explain it. You just said, "Come and see." That was always your way. You weren't the loudest. You weren't the leader. But you had this quiet urgency, like someone who had glimpsed fire in a dark field and couldn't rest until everyone else had seen it too. You asked him honest questions. "Show us the Father. How can we know the way?" And he answered with words that cracked open heaven. You never forgot them. You carried those answers with you like bread for a journey. And you walked farther than anyone thought you would, across the edges of Asia Minor, into cities that had never heard of Galilee, much less a man from it. You baptized merchants and mothers and widows. You healed wounds in alleyways with nothing but a whisper and a touch. You spoke in courtyards, under trees, in doorways, always pointing, always calling. Come and see. But light disrupts, and those who held power over shadows noticed. They dragged you through the streets, not out of fear, but out of anger. You were too quiet to fear, too steady. That unsettled them. They didn't beat you at first. They bound your arms and legs and lifted you by your ankles, hung you upside down like a question no one wanted to answer. Blood rushed to your head. The sky flipped, the world pulsing with pressure behind your eyes. Still, you spoke. Not loudly, but clearly. You told them about the man who sat by wells and walked through storms, the one who fed thousands with crumbs and gave sight with spit and mud. You told them that even here, upside down, broken, forgotten, he was still with you. They mocked you, said your words meant nothing, said your God was weak, but you kept whispering. One man in the crowd turned his head. That was enough. They left you there for hours. Birds circled. The sun burned your skin. You didn't beg to be taken down. You just kept pointing. Even when your hands couldn't move. Even when your voice cracked and faded. You died like you lived. Not in a blaze, but like a lamp in a window. Steady, faithful, calling. You brought others to the light and died in the shadows. Their names are gone now, worn away by time, lost between scrolls never written and tongues that never knew how to pronounce them. No monuments, no letters, no books of the Bible etched in their honor. Just echoes in the dust, passed down in whispers from one mouth to the next, until even the whispers faded. But they were there. They walked the roads no one wanted, places too wild, too far, too forgotten. Not for glory, not for legacy, but because someone had to go. Because Jesus said, "Go into all the world and they believed he meant it. Ethiopia, Armenia, Parthia, mountains with snow like silence, valleys with heat like judgment, villages where no one had ever heard of Jerusalem, let alone a Jewish rabbi who spoke of love and washed the feet of men who would run from him. They entered those places with nothing but a name and a story, and most of the time, not even their own names survived the journey. Some say they healed the sick, cast out demons, baptized whole tribes in rivers that knew no map. Some say they were chased out with stones, beaten, drowned, hung from trees and bridges and wooden crosses far from home, but they stayed as long as they could, and when they died with his name on their lips. Not all were apostles. Some were simply disciples, converts, listeners who turned into witnesses. A woman who once heard Paul preach in a foreign tongue, a merchant who saw Peter's eyes and couldn't forget them, a teenager who found himself praying under stars in the middle of a Roman outpost and didn't know why. They weren't famous. They weren't strong. They weren't remembered. But they were his. One of them, maybe, died in a ditch beside a road in Parthia, bones broken, hands still clenched in prayer. Another bled out behind a barn in the mountains of Armenia, singing until the blade silenced him. A third may have lived to old age, quietly retelling the gospel to children until breath no longer came. No scrolls mark those moments. No basilica bears their name, but heaven does. Every drop of blood, every breath given in witness, every name spoken in secret by trembling lips. He saw them. They didn't need to be great. They just needed to be faithful. And they were. You won't find them in paintings. You won't see them quoted in Sunday sermons. But their footprints are still there, pressed into the soil of nations that now call him Lord because someone said yes in silence, because someone went when no one else would. God remembers the names history forgot. Their bones were scattered like seeds, across hills and deserts, beneath cathedrals and cities, built centuries later. Stone boxes etched with names or symbols, fingers wrapped in gold, skulls sealed behind glass and incense. People came from miles away to kneel beside them, to whisper prayers into the dirt where saints once bled, to see, maybe, that someone bled for this before them. Philip, Matthew, Thomas. Pieces of them carried across continents, some wrapped in linen, others lost in fire, some stolen by kings and monks who claimed it brought power to hold a rib or a toe. Some never found again, buried in ground no longer holy, or ground made holy by the blood it drank. Pilgrims still search for them, the tombs, the relics, the places where sacrifice became stone. They build shrines, paint icons, carve statues with palms raised or faces tilted upward, not just to remember, but to belong, to anchor their faith to something that once had breath. Most of the apostles are buried somewhere, roughly, softly, some with markers, others without. But one was different, because one tomb, the one that mattered most, never kept its occupant. They tried to seal it with stone, with guards, with silence, but it didn't stay shut. It couldn't, because death never had the right to hold him. The others died remembering that empty space, that rolled away stone, that morning sun lighting up linen strips with no body inside them. They walked into death unafraid because he had already walked out of it. And there was one more thing the world couldn't explain. One apostle, one witness, whose body no one ever found, because he didn't die like the others. Not by sword, not by flame, not even by exile. You thought you'd go first, maybe with Peter, maybe in the same fire. You had always been close behind him after all. Where he walked, you followed. When he spoke, you listened. But the flames took him, and you stayed. Then James, then the others. One by one, they disappeared like candles in a storm, until their voices lived only in the mouths of those they'd baptized. And still you breathed. Still you woke up to silence and memory. You are John, the disciple Jesus loved, the one who leaned against his chest at supper, the one who stood at the cross when others fled, the one he trusted with his mother, the one who saw the empty tomb first and still stepped back so Peter could enter. You saw everything, and you remembered. You watched miracles unfold like light cracking through clouds. You saw water listen to him, saw demons obey. You saw him raise the dead with a whisper and silence storms with a hand. And then you saw him broken, bleeding, dying, and still you stayed. Then you watched him live again. That moment never left you. Not when you preached, not when they dragged you from the temple, not when they boiled you in oil and you lived, not when they exiled you to an island no one visited unless they were forgotten. They tried to kill you. They tried again and again, but every time, breath filled your lungs like it had been commanded to. You didn't want to live forever. You didn't even want to outlive the ones you loved. You wanted to go the same way they did, with a sword, a flame, a stone, something simple, something finished. But he didn't let you. He gave you something else. A pen. You didn't want it. You wanted rest, silence, peace. But instead, he gave you words and visions, and sky splitting open like a scroll. You sat on the rocks of Patmos, knees stiff, back aching, staring into a sky that refused to blink. And you wrote. You wrote about lambs and dragons and trumpets and thrones. You wrote about blood and crowns and a rider on a white horse. You wrote with trembling hands, not to confuse, but to comfort, to remind the scattered, the hunted, the waiting, he has not forgotten. He is coming back. You watched empires fall in your mind. You saw heaven crash into earth, and then it was quiet again. You set the pen down and looked out over the sea. Old, alone, unfinished, but full. You were the last one left, not because you were stronger, but because he still had something for you to say. You didn't get the martyr's crown. You got a pen. You wanted death, but he gave you a pen instead. The heat should have taken you. That was the plan. A public death. Quick, brutal, spectacular. They wanted to break you open in front of a crowd, to make you scream in the oil and prove that your God couldn't save you. They lit the fire beneath the vat. They tied your hands. They lifted you high for everyone to see. The sun was overhead, and the smell of smoke clung to the air. You didn't say a word. They dropped you in, and waited for the screaming. But it never came. You felt the oil. You felt the heat. You felt the weight of death pressing close, like it always had in the shadows of the empire. But something held it back. Your skin didn't blister. Your lungs didn't seize. The pain that should have torn you apart never arrived. You stood in the vat, slick with oil, blinking against the smoke. Still breathing. Still alive. The crowd didn't cheer. They stared. Even the soldiers took a step back, as if you might start glowing. You didn't. You just stood there, waiting, wondering why death hadn't come this time either, wondering again why all the others were gone, and you still remained. Peter had burned. Paul had bled. James had fallen from a rooftop and died praying through broken ribs. But you, the youngest once, the last now, remained untouched by the blade, by the flame, by the boil. You weren't fearless, but you were resolved. So when they pulled you from the vat, furious and afraid, you didn't ask questions. You knew better by now. You didn't fight when they dragged you through the streets. You didn't protest when they declared you too dangerous to kill, too dangerous to die. So they chose exile, not execution. They sent you to the island, Patmos, a wound in the sea. No temple, no market, no crowd to preach to, just rock and salt and silence. You walked off the boat with shackles around your wrists and a name that echoed like thunder in their ears. You were John, the one Jesus loved, the one who refused to burn, the one Rome couldn't bury. You were alone. No brothers, no friends, no crowd to listen, no oil to drown you, just waves and sky and memory. You could still hear his voice sometimes, in the hush between tides, in the rustle of olive trees on the cliffside, in your own heartbeat, still thudding steady against the odds. You should have died, but you didn't. So they sent you to an island, alone. The days passed without counting. There was no need. The sun still rose, the sea still roared, but time on Patmos didn't feel like it did anywhere else. It stretched, sank, dissolved into the rock. There were no crowds, no temples, no letters to carry, no footsteps behind yours in the dust, just wind, stone, and the sound of your own breath echoing too loud inside your chest. You tried to pray. Some days it felt like speaking into a canyon. Other days it was the only thing holding your bones together. You remembered the faces. Peter's voice, James's laugh, Thomas's hands shaking as he finally believed. You remembered the table, the garden, the hill, the tomb. You remembered him, and you waited. Some nights, the stars over the sea felt like eyes, watching, weeping, waiting with you. And then, one morning, everything cracked. It started like a trumpet. Not music, not melody, just sound, pure and impossible, like 1,000 mountains crying out at once. It didn't come from the sky. It came from everywhere. Through the rock, through your bones, through your soul. And then the voice. You'd heard it before. On hillsides, at meals, in the silence of a broken tomb. But this was different. This wasn't the whisper of a rabbi or the cry of a dying friend. This was the voice that called stars into place, that thundered through eternity before time began. You fell to the ground, hands shaking, heart pounding like war. Do not be afraid. You couldn't look up, but the voice kept speaking. I am the first and the last. I was dead, and now look, I am alive forever and ever. You couldn't move. You couldn't breathe. He stood behind you, the Son of Man, eyes like fire, feet like bronze, a sword in his mouth, 7 stars in his hand, his robe white, his face brighter than the sun when it dares to burn the earth. This was not the Jesus who washed feet. This was not the Jesus who wept. This was the one who reigns, the one who holds keys, the one who comes again. He touched you, not to punish, not to overwhelm, just to lift. And then he spoke again. 3 words, the command that would become your breath. Write what you see. You still didn't know why you'd lived when the others had died. Still didn't understand why oil hadn't burned, why blades hadn't struck, why Rome had failed. But in that moment, it no longer mattered. You weren't here to understand. You were here to witness. The sea pounded against the cliffs. The wind howled like birth and burial. You opened your eyes, and you began to write. It began with the sound of a door, not one you could see, not made of wood or bronze or iron, just the sensation of something opening in the sky, like the breath before thunder, like the silence before creation speaks. And then a voice, the same voice from before, calling to you like a command that had already been obeyed. Come up here. You didn't know if your body moved or stayed, whether your feet still touched stone or floated somewhere beyond it. All you knew was that the veil lifted, and nothing would ever be the same again. Heaven, not clouds, not wings, not harps and floating dreams. A throne, high, alive, flames wrapped around it like worship. Thunder crashed beneath it like praise. A rainbow, emerald and fire, circled it, not in softness, but in splendor. And surrounding that throne were others, 24, crowned and watching, their heads bowed and their voices echoing with one word that never tired. Holy. You couldn't look away. Lightning flashed. Creatures covered in eyes and wings flew and turned and cried out. One like a lion, one like an ox, one like a man, one like an eagle. And every time they moved, every time they sang, the ground shook with glory. You fell on your face. Then came the scroll, held in the hand of the one on the throne. 7 seals. No one could open it. No one could even look at it. And you wept. You wept because it felt like all of history was bound in that scroll, like every pain, every prayer, every promise waited for it to be unsealed. But no hand reached for it. No voice claimed it. Until the Lamb stepped forward. You hadn't seen him before. Now you could see nothing else. A lamb. Slain. Yet, standing. He moved without fear. He took the scroll with hands still marked by nails, and all of heaven erupted. Crowns flew from heads, harps and bowls spilled over with the prayers of the saints. Every creature, above, below, beneath the sea, sang one song with one voice. Worthy. You trembled, because you knew what would come next. The seals broke, each one like a heartbeat of war, a rhythm of judgment. The pale horse, the red, the black, the white, blood and famine and fire and silence. Trumpets sounded, bowls poured, cities fell. The dragon rose, beasts marched. The earth convulsed with groaning, but through it all, the Lamb stood. You wrote every word, not with pride, not with understanding, but with fear and awe and obedience. The bride appeared, dressed in white. The enemy fell, chained in shadow. A city descended from heaven, built of jewels and light. And he was there, not just at the center, but everywhere. He wiped every tear. He swallowed death. He made all things new. You laid the pen down and looked out over the sea that now felt too small, too quiet. You had seen what no man ever had, and lived to tell it. They told you when the wind shifted. A ship on the horizon. A new emperor. Rome's hand loosening. Domitian was gone. Dead not by war or old age, but by a dagger in the dark. And with him, your exile ended. They untied your wrists without ceremony. No apology. Just the word, go. You looked once more at the sea, the cliffs of Patmos behind you, and waited to feel free. You didn't, because you hadn't been imprisoned by chains. You had been held by vision. The boat rocked as you sailed back, but your hands didn't grip the rail. They gripped memory. You had seen creatures with wings and eyes. You had heard trumpets no ear could translate. You had written words that didn't belong to you, only passed through you like fire. And now you return to dust, to streets, to people, to the sound of sandals on stone. Ephesus waited like a breath held too long. The air tasted of salt and fig, and something quieter. Reverence, maybe. The churches had grown. New faces, unfamiliar prayers. Voices young with zeal but unsure how to carry the weight you wore like a second skin. They didn't know what to say. Some whispered as you walked by, "That's him. The last one. The beloved." But you had no need for titles. You had outlived all the others. You had seen Peter crucified. You had heard of Thomas pierced by spears. You had watched James die at the hands of Rome. You had walked past the table where it all began, and only echoes answered. Now you were back in the city where love once burned hot enough to shake the stones, where the spirit moved in alleyways and crowds wept when truth was spoken. But things had changed. The fire was still there, but so was fatigue. So was distraction, and the slow temptation to soften what once burned. You didn't raise your voice. You didn't write new letters. You simply showed up, an old man with eyes that had seen too much. You sat in the back while younger men preached. You prayed louder than most. You sang with a voice made rough by time and smoke and silence. You were not trying to be remembered. You were trying to remember. And still, they asked, what was he like? You always smiled when they did, because no word ever seemed big enough, not even the ones you had written. You told them about the touch of his hand, the sound of his breath as he slept, the way his eyes held you in your worst moment and didn't let go. You told them he was the Word, and the Lamb, and the King. You told them he was coming back, and they believed you, not because you made it dramatic, but because you still looked like someone who had seen him. The years passed slower now. Your hands shook more, but your voice never did, because you had nothing left to lose, and everything still to say. You saw the first light, and the last. Your legs don't carry you like they used to. Once you walked miles across deserts and cities, up temple steps and through prison gates. Now, even the walk to the doorway takes more time than it should. You lean on others, younger arms beneath yours, strong and sure, and unaware of how quickly strength slips away. But they still listen when you speak. You used to say more, preach longer, teach deeper. You remember the scrolls, the letters, the nights of wrestling words into sentences that could hold the weight of glory. But now your breath comes short. Your voice shakes when you raise it. So you say less. You say the same thing, over and over again. Little children, love one another. Some nod with understanding, some with confusion, some wait for more. But you give them nothing else. Not anymore. You've seen enough to know what survives the fire. Not knowledge, not eloquence, not prophecy. Love. The kind that holds a hand at the grave. The kind that forgives, even as nails tear flesh. The kind that washes feet and breaks bread and stays through the worst nights. You've watched that kind of love change cowards into saints, rebels into witnesses, enemies into brothers. And you've watched it die on crosses and rise from tombs. So now, that's what you give them. Not because you've run out of things to say, but because that one thing is enough. You remember him. You always do. Not just the miracles, not just the light on the mountain or the stillness on the water. You remember his hands, the way he touched the sick, the way he steadied Peter as he sank, the way he pressed his fingers into your feet when he knelt and washed you. You remember his eyes when he looked at Judas. You remember the sound of his voice when he said your name after the resurrection. He never said, "I told you so." He never demanded you do more. He just said, "Feed my sheep." And you've tried. Even now you try. You sit before them, bones brittle, skin thin, eyes clouded by time, but your heart still beats with the same fire that started when he called you from the nets. That fire has flickered in storms and exile and loneliness, but it never died, because he never left. So you raise your voice one more time. Little children, love one another. Someone in the back wipes their eyes. Someone whispers the words again under their breath. Someone decides, right then, to forgive. You see it. You see all of it. You know that many of them won't remember the details, won't quote your sermons or memorize your letters, but they'll remember this moment, this phrase, this call, because it isn't yours. It's his. And it echoes still. You lean back. You close your eyes. It's the only sermon you have left. And it's enough. You can feel it coming. The air thins. The weight shifts in your chest. It isn't fear. It's something softer. Like laying down a coat that's kept you warm for a lifetime but is finally too heavy to carry. You've outlived everyone. You've told the story more times than you can count. And now, There are no more pages left to write, only the quiet. The room is small, dim, and still. Someone lights a lamp in the corner. You hear murmurs, sandals on stone, the soft rustling of robes. You recognize a few of them. Faces aged by time, etched with hope. They sit close. Not because you speak, but because you breathe. And soon, you won't. You once thought you'd die young. Maybe with James, maybe in Jerusalem, maybe at the hands of men who hated the truth you carried. But every time death came near, it passed by. Oil didn't burn you. Exile didn't break you. Even silence became your servant, not your sentence. You've dreamed of them often in these last days. Peter, laughing too loud around the fire. Thomas, eyes wide with disbelief and wonder. James praying as he fell. Andrew's quiet voice. Philip's calm. Bartholomew's blood-soaked courage. They come in waves, not as ghosts, but as memories so sharp they ache. You can see them standing beside the teacher again, the wind catching their cloaks, the sea at their backs. They're younger in your mind than they ever were in life, undimmed, unafraid. You wonder if they'll greet you when you cross over. You wonder if he will speak your name again. You close your eyes, just for a moment. The breath slows. You feel hands rest lightly on your shoulders. They're praying. Whispered words you can no longer answer. But you hear them. Everyone. You think of the first time he called you. By the shore. Net still wet. Heart still small. You didn't know then what that one step would cost, or how much it would give. You think of the mountain where his face changed, the garden where he wept, the cross where the sky broke open, the tomb that didn't hold him, and the fire that fell after he left. You remember the scroll in heaven, the Lamb, the city of gold, and now your breath thins again. One last dream. You see him. He's not walking this time. He's standing, waiting, not as a rabbi, not even as the King of Glory, but as the friend who never left. You reach for him, and then stillness. No cry, no thunder, just breathless quiet, the kind that follows a long, faithful life. You are John, the last to see him face to face, the last to hear his voice, the last to hold his mother's hand, the last to write it down, and now, the last of the 12, gone, but not silent. It wasn't always this way. You didn't begin as a traitor. You followed him like the others did, bare feet on dusty roads, watching miracles spill from his hands like light from cracks in the sky. You laughed with them, prayed beside them, ate the bread. He broke and nodded when he spoke of the kingdom. No one saw it coming, not even you, at first. You were trusted. You held the money bag. You kept track of the offerings, made the purchases, looked the part, and you believed, or convinced yourself you did. Maybe that's what hurt the most. That even in your silence, even in your performance, he saw you. Every moment, every motive. Still, he let you stay. He washed your feet the night you planned to betray him. He looked at you during dinner. Not through you, not past you, but into you. And he fed you anyway. You told yourself there was a reason, that he was moving too slowly, that his talk of dying and rising made no sense, that if you pushed the right button, pressed the right nerve, maybe he'd reveal his power, rise up and claim what was his. You wanted to force a crown onto a man who came for a cross. So you went to them. You named the price. 30 coins. Not because he was worthless, but because that was what your heart settled for. You thought you could control the moment. You thought you could back out if it went too far. But the moment he met your eyes in the garden, something snapped. He called you friend, and you kissed him. That kiss burned longer than the silver ever shone. The coins clinked in your hands like mockery. And when the soldiers dragged him away, no one stopped them. Not even you. You watched the trial unfold, the slaps, the spit, the silence. You watched Peter fall apart and still stay closer than you dared. And suddenly, the silver weighed more than your soul could hold. You ran. You tried to give it back, shouting that he was innocent. But they laughed. They had already used you. The coins hit the floor of the temple with a sound that never left your ears. You found the rope yourself. No one chased you. No one stopped you. You died hanging from a tree, swinging in silence, while the world turned and the sky prepared to darken. Your blood stained the ground, and no one wept. You were close. So close. You heard every sermon. You watched every healing. You saw him calm storms, raise the dead, forgive sinners, and look at you with mercy, even as you unmade him. But none of it reached your heart. You wanted his kingdom, but not his cross. You wanted what he could give, not who he was. And in the end, that was the difference. You were close, but never changed. You weren't there when he fed the 5,000. You didn't see him walking on water, didn't feel the wind stop in an instant beneath his voice. You weren't in the inner circle, not like Peter or John or James. But you were there all the same, at the edges, always watching, always following, quiet, steady, never asked to speak, never needed to. But you believed. You were there when the sky went black, when the curtain tore, when the whispers turned to fire and the fire became language. You saw him risen, not once, not a dream, but real, breathing, alive. And it changed something deep in you. So far in it didn't need words, just obedience. Then they gathered, the 11. And there was a gap, a wound shaped like betrayal. They said the number had to be whole again. Not for symmetry, for witness, for something older than even they understood. And so they prayed. And so they cast lots. And so the stone fell in your favor. Your name was called. Not for your strength, not for your voice, just your faithfulness. Matthias, the one no one expected, the one everyone forgot, but heaven didn't. You took up the mantle with no fanfare, no flash, just feet that kept walking forward into the same dirt roads and foreign cities, into markets where your voice shook with nerves but stayed loud enough to say his name, into temples where your presence alone caused outrage, into houses where strangers became brothers after 5 minutes in a miracle. You didn't write a gospel. No one recorded your sermons. But you bled for the same Christ. You stood where Stephen stood, where Peter preached, where James fell, and you did not flinch. You knew what it meant. You knew where it ended. You walked anyway. Some say they stoned you. Others say you were crucified. Still others, that you were beheaded beside a stream whose name no one remembers now. It doesn't matter. What matters is you didn't walk away. You never asked to be remembered. You asked to be faithful, and that was enough. The world forgot your words, forgot your grave, forgot even the city where you fell. But heaven kept the record. Heaven knew your voice. Heaven heard every step you took in his name. And somewhere, far beyond time, beyond the reach of memory and shadow and ruin, your name is still spoken with joy. Because even the quietest lives can echo. You stand in the ruins now, stones half buried, inscriptions worn smooth by centuries of wind. You trace your fingers along broken walls, sunken altars, fields that once rang with footsteps and voices that dared to speak the name. Most of their graves are lost, swallowed by time and earth. Some lie beneath cathedrals, others beneath highways and cities and soil no one calls sacred anymore. But you feel it. You feel the weight in the ground beneath your feet. They were here. Peter, Paul, Thomas, James, Andrew. Names spoken now in liturgy and legend, but once They bled in places like this. Once, they woke to chains and cold floors and the sound of mobs outside their doors. They weren't born heroes. They were men with hands like yours, skin that bruised, voices that cracked when fear pressed too hard. And still, they followed. They followed into prisons, into deserts, into ships torn by storms and temples filled with blades. They followed into cities that laughed, into courts that judged, into silence that fell heavy after the crowds were gone. They followed when it cost them their names, their families, their breath. Some died screaming. Some died singing. Some died alone in darkness. No one left to hold their hand but the God they had trusted when light still filled the sky. But none died in vain. You bend beside a forgotten slab of stone, too cracked to read, and you wonder who lay beneath. Maybe it's no one. Maybe it's someone who heard Peter once, or touched Paul's robe, or wept at Stephen's death. Maybe it's someone like you, someone who heard the story secondhand, but still chose to believe it. Because the story didn't die when the apostles did. It grew. It spread like fire, quiet and quick, from lips to hearts to nations. It whispered through catacombs. It roared through empires. It found the cracks in every kingdom built on power and pride, and it rooted itself there, in weakness, in sacrifice. It made orphans into family. It made slaves into brothers. It made fools into saints. And now, here you are. 2,000 years later, the dust still settles, and the world keeps turning. But the same spirit burns, the same name is spoken, and the same call remains. Follow me. You don't need to see a miracle. You don't need to touch his hands. You just need to say yes. You just need to keep walking. Because they didn't follow for fame. They followed for love. They didn't endure for glory. They endured because they had seen the empty tomb. They died screaming. They died singing. They died alone. But they died believing, and the world has never been the same.